Hi, I'm Brandy Wisman, Policy Analyst for the Council of State Governments, and I staff the Equity and Inclusion Subcommittee of CSG's Future of Work National Task Force. The subcommittee has identified using correct language as being an important part of the conversation when discussing equity and inclusion in the workforce. I'm talking today with Representative Donna Bullock about the crucial difference between equity and equality. Representative Bullock currently sits on the CSG Future of Work Equity and Inclusion Subcommittee and is a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives representing the 195th Legislative District in North and West Philadelphia. We've had many conversations on equity and equality in our Equity and Inclusion Subcommittee. At the base level, what is the difference in equity and equality?
Sure. So equity and equality sounds a lot like the same, but they're very much different. So equality is a word that we've heard a lot, and it means that everyone gets the same. We get exactly the same thing. Equity is different in that people get what they need. So that may be different from what someone else gets. If you need more, if you need less. And so that very, very basic level, that's the difference between the two.
Okay, so why do you think people tend to use these words so interchangeably?
I think when people hear words like equity and equality, there's these words that you're not able to really touch them. They have similar letters in them. They sound the same. You think it's the same word, and we may have used them in legislation or in policy, but when you're looking at those two words, it's really about your goals. Do you want everyone to be treated the same? And that sounds like what most people would want to do. Do you want everybody to be treated the same? The answer to that may be yes. But if you dig a little deeper, the real question is, do we want everyone to have access, to have a fair opportunity, to be able to succeed, to be able to do well? And for our economy, for the strength of our nation, these are questions we really have to ask. A lot of times we talk about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, the question is, does everyone need the same pair of boots, or do they need something else? So if we took something like, let's talk about a supermarket, and you have three neighborhoods or three individuals that may surround this particular supermarket. I was looking at an example like this online the other day. Well, one neighborhood may have no transportation system and unsafe streets. The other neighborhood may need a boat to get to the supermarket. There may be a river or something separating the supermarket, while the third neighborhood may just be a block away. Well, not everybody needs boots to get there. One may need a boat, one may need bicycle system or a bus system, while the other neighborhood can just walk to that supermarket. So this is one example in which we may see equity and equality playing out differently, but we see it in other policy that we talk about all the time, like education. We talk all the time about children having access to a quality education regardless of class, economic class, zip code, or race. But the reality is that depending on how you fund your education in your state, some students with the most needs may end up attending schools with the least capacity to serve them. Students with the most needs may need, more special education teachers, more, English as a second language teachers. You may have students in school buildings that have lead and asbestos and other issues that may impact their learning. Students who may have to travel further to get to their school. And so when we talk about funding these particular schools, we have to look at how a state invests in their schools. And then, another factor is how a local municipality may support their schools, whether through real estate taxes or other resources that can also impact how much funding a school district receives and whether or not a state should supplement that funding or provide different funding based on that particular school district and the needs of the students in that school. So these are different ways in which we see equity and equality playing out in policy, whether it's transportation or education, healthcare. If you give everyone the same, it may not actually work out where everyone has the same or a fair opportunity to succeed in the same access.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up kind of that early education, early start piece. As we're looking at kind of that early start in education, how does that end up affecting the futures of these communities, particularly in terms of the workforce?
Right. So if you look at education, and we're saying we know that education is the strength of our workforce, strength of our families, strength of our nations. We depend on it. Then, as legislators and policymakers, we should want to invest in that education right off the bat. And this brings up another three words of that often get interchanged a lot for me. Words like underserved, underprivileged, and underrepresented, right? When you look at those three words, how do they interplay and how do they mean different things? So an underserved community is one in which there are fewer resources or goods going into that community. In this case, a school district that may not be getting the same resources as another school district. And so when you're in a community or in a school district that's underserved, then you may end up being someone who is underprivileged, possibly, someone who doesn't have the same standard of living or the same standard of rights, same access, because you didn't receive the same services or goods as another community or another school district. And then because of that, now you end up being a person that's underrepresented in the workforce, a person that that's not included in that workforce because perhaps you didn't have the same resources and tools particularly through your education growing up. So now communities are not, or certain populations are not represented in the workforce relative to their population in the general, to their numbers in the general population, because they didn't have access from the very beginning, because they didn't have equity in their schools, and they didn't have equity in the healthcare that they received, or equity in other aspects of their upbringing to prepare them for the workforce and to prepare them to be competitive in the workforce. And we all hurt for that. At the end of the day, we want a workforce that is diverse, a workforce that brings in a wealth of experience, a wealth of innovation, and we get that from a diverse workforce that includes the last word I would say that we don't use often when we're talking about underserved and underprivileged and underrepresented communities. When we don't include those communities and we don't include those populations, our workforce suffers from untapped talent. So I looked at those communities and say they're not underserved or underprivileged and underrepresented. They're more untapped. These are folks that we are losing in our workforce because we didn't give them the tools and the resources from the very beginning.
So you and I have talked pretty extensively about language and just how important it is. So I'm really glad you brought up those words, underserved, underprivileged, underrepresented, and untapped. Why do you think language is such an important part of this conversation and using the correct words to describe the experience?
Unfortunately, words like underserved and underprivileged, underrepresented, have over time, and depending on the context, can be diminishing or belittling to a community. Some of those words in the wrong context can be code words and can allude to being insufficient or inadequate. Often I hear those words, underserved communities, sometimes means a code word that you're talking just about Black and Brown communities, where underserved communities can be in rural communities that are predominantly Caucasian. They can be communities in the city. They can be communities anywhere in our country. But we have a tendency to use these words interchangeably a lot, and sometimes in ways that people assume it means something about a certain group or a certain person. And those words are very powerful if they're not used appropriately and if they're not used in context with an understanding of who exactly you're talking about and what are you saying when you're using those words. You can have someone who is underrepresented in the medical profession or the legal profession because they're a person of color, but that doesn't mean that that person grew up in a quote unquote underserved community. It just means that that population of people of color are not represented in those professions. And so we should be very careful about the words that we use and what what we intend to say and what the what may come across by others to mean something else. Some of those words can be marginalizing because of the context and because of how they've been used in the past. And so those are words we should be very cautious about when we're using, and making sure that we're thinking about, the undertones of what those words, the messaging that those words come across.
So as we're kind of wrapping up, are there any final words that you would like to share?
Yes, I think that, as a committee, we have a responsibility to look at all of the words that are used in the conversations that we have, and to ask questions if we're not sure if we're using the right word, or even if we think a word may mean one thing or another, ask our peers and our colleagues, does this word have any other meanings to you? Because words are powerful, and words, can, we may all move forward on a piece of policy or legislation thinking that we all are on the same page. And as we get into the details, realize that words that are used in that policy can have a very different meaning for one to another. And sometimes it's regional, sometimes it's by our own experience. And so, we all have a responsibility to speak up if a word appears to be offensive to you or someone you know, or the use of that word in that context is, and to also ask, on the same time, ask those questions if you're unsure. We have, a great committee that is working on a very important issue. And when it comes to diversity in the workplace, words like equity and equality, underserved, underprivileged, underrepresented, untapped, and inclusion can be very powerful. And so as we move forward, I hope that we are cautious and strategic about the words that we use.
Representative Bullock, I want to thank you again just for joining us today and providing your perspective. This is really going to help greatly to inform the work as we move forward in our subcommittee and task force. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to our next meeting in June.